Now for the main event. I'd now like to welcome Andrew Marr to the stage to give us an insight into one of the most uncertain and risk-filled areas of life, politics. Andrew.
Well, thank you very much, John. You are all the risk experts, and by God, we need you at Westminster right now. Very, very kind of you to invite me here, particularly since the political commentariat is in such a bad way this morning. If you've seen the new Private Eye, you will have enjoyed 2 pages of Schadenfreude about all the catastrophically wrong guesstimates made before the election. All the very, very clever, highly paid people telling you there's going to be a Tory majority of 150, 200, 160, 100, and so forth. I'm not in that game anymore, so I'm able to say that I'm not there as somebody who got it so wrong. But first confession of the day. In the sanctity, we were hearing about pubs earlier on, in the sanctity of my local pub, my guess was a Tory majority of 90. And since then, I have been buying beer for lots of gloating mates who've been teasing me remorselessly. As a result of what happened, Westminster is a scene of fast-moving change and chaos. Things to come, we have no idea, or do we? I'm going to come on to that in a second. We've got a kind of running buffet of humble pie with grovel sauce alongside. The Prime Minister leading her way, scoffing as much as she can, followed by virtually every commentator in the business. And there are various big questions which are now out there and hard to avoid. First of all, can Theresa May, after this catastrophic election campaign, really survive much longer as Prime Minister? What's going to happen to Brexit? That must be off the agenda, surely, and much else besides. What I'm going to try to do today is talk you through what I think is going to happen on the basis of lots of conversations with people whose names, unfortunately, I still can't reveal, but are at the centre of things. When you are looking at a big risk situation, a very fluid and mobile and difficult political situation, in particular like we have at the moment, I find there are 2 things absolutely essential to do. The first thing is to ask, what is the key fact? What is the biggest fact on which everything else is going to ultimately depend? And then the second thing is to look at the numbers. Well, the big key fact, I suggest to you, is perhaps a rather banal-sounding one, but nonetheless, the Conservative Party won the election. Now, you wouldn't think it from a lot of the commentary afterwards, but the Conservatives have the largest number of seats, and if they do their deal with the DUP, we still haven't had the details of that deal yet, but if they do their deal with the DUP, they can govern in the House of Commons, and no other party is in that position. So that is, if you like, the simple, surface, slightly banal, big fact. But what lies behind that fact? And again, we have to ask ourselves, what is this Conservative Party therefore thinking? What ultimately are they above all trying to achieve? Well, the thing they're mainly trying to achieve is to avoid another bloody general election, because they know damn well that if it happens, they're likely to be defeated and Jeremy Corbyn will become Prime Minister. So the Conservative Party, as a beast, its collective first thought is, we are not going to have a general election for a long time to come. We've had enough of those. What depends upon that? That means that Theresa May almost certainly stays as Prime Minister for quite a long time to come. Let's go back a bit and remember that the Brexit process is ticking. The Conservative Party, by having this unnecessary election, and for them a catastrophic election, delayed for crucial weeks talks that now need to start very quickly, and delayed their own preparation for those talks. If now a Conservative or group of Conservatives decide to try to topple Theresa May as Prime Minister, I can't think of anybody particular, but it might be some chap with large hair and loafing around the undergrowth chaps, you know, sniff of blood in the water, fantastic. If somebody like that, or a group of them, decide to launch a putsch against the Prime Minister, and the Conservative Party has to go into an extended period trying to choose a new leader, then that's another 3 or 4 weeks, or possibly 2 months, out of the Brexit negotiations. We have not, as a country, got that time. That'd be an act of such catastrophic misjudgment and self-indulgence that those people would be badly, badly punished, ultimately. You'd then get some poor sod who'd be the next Prime Minister at that point. They would be under huge pressure to have the very general election the Tory party is trying to avoid at all costs, because you've got a new Prime Minister, a new direction, and no mandate, again, which means a collapse of the Conservative Party. I don't think it is possible for the Conservatives to have a leadership election now or for the foreseeable future without totally disrupting the Brexit talks and forcing them into a further general election, which they will lose. So, point one, against a lot of the commentary at the moment, I think Theresa May is going to stay as Prime Minister for months and possibly even for a couple of years. Point two, however, let's get to the numbers, because the numbers are really, really important here. The Tories, with the DUP, have a very small majority. But that's just the first numbers. You have to look below the headlines. There are 13 Conservative Scottish MPs. That is, there's more of them than there are of the DUP. Their leader, the extraordinary Ruth Davidson, lesbian kickboxer extraordinaire, and the most successful and charismatic politician in Britain, apart from Jeremy Corbyn at the moment, has made it clear that she wants a different kind of Brexit, what she calls an open Brexit, and she wants to talk to the other parties about what that might mean. Now, that raises the possibility that the Scottish Tory MPs might not vote with Theresa May for her kind of Brexit. I've put this to ministers at the heart of the government, and they say if they did that, they would be cutting their own throats, there'd have to be an election, and we would never forgive them. We would lynch them before they got away from Westminster. That's one bit of the arithmetic you have to look at. Then you've got the Labour Party side, where there's probably 20 or 30 quite hardcore anti-Brussels, pro-Brexit MPs. I don't think the Scottish MPs will ultimately vote against Theresa May. The DUP will be bound in, whatever deal they do, on Brexit. That's not going to change. Therefore, we have the DUP, the Scottish MPs will eventually side with the government, and there are Labour MPs as well who will, when push comes to shove, support the idea of Brexit. Don't forget, the Labour Party went into this election as well with the promise, the commitment that they accepted the outcome of the referendum and they would stick by it. So you put all of that together, I find it quite easy to see that Theresa May can still, even now, win the crucial votes on Brexit in the House of Commons. That doesn't mean, so let's assess where we've got so far. Prime Minister stays, Brexit goes ahead. But the third and really crucial question is what kind of Brexit? And at this point, we have to get into the language and the technicalities a little bit. There is a great sort of bubbling, iridescent bubble of optimism around the unreconciled Remoaners or Remainers who think that Brexit is not going to happen now. And that has been fueled by the following things. It's been fueled by noises off from the continent. Both Emmanuel Macron, now with a big en marche majority in the National Assembly in Paris, and Wolfgang Schäuble, who is the veteran and very, very influential German economics minister in Berlin, have said in the last 24 hours that the door is open. If the British want to give up Brexit and come back in after this disastrous election, they're very welcome to do so. And then here we've had not one, not two, but three former Conservative leaders, John Major, David Cameron, and William Hague, all saying that they think it should be looked at again, a different kind of Brexit is important, and Theresa May has to change direction. That's very interesting. There's a big, significant bubble of pressure for no Brexit at all or a radically different kind of Brexit. And then we have possibly the most important issue of all, which is what happens inside the current cabinet. It is absolutely true that Theresa May had decided to get rid of Philip Hammond as Chancellor had she come back with a big majority. The reason for that is that Philip Hammond is not seen as committed to Brexit, partly because he is representing the views of the city and the financial industries in particular. But he is now re-energised, the Treasury is fighting hard for a much softer form of Brexit, and among its potential allies inside the cabinet, of course, there is now the Deputy Prime Minister, Damien Green, old university friend of Theresa May. She doesn't have many old university friends. She spent far too much of her early life running through fields of wheat. But she has a few. And Damien is certainly one. And Damien is as Europhile and dripping wet as it gets. So you're beginning to see, not from the wheat, you're beginning to see the possible lineup of a soft Brexit, even anti-Brexit group inside the cabinet. Now, of course, Theresa May has been very clever. She's brought in Michael Gove on the other side. So the cabinet is slightly more balanced. But you possibly divided cabinet. You have a House of Commons where lots and lots of MPs are thinking again, have we got it wrong, not just on austerity, but on everything, including Brexit? And you've got those siren voices from the continent saying, come on back. You don't need to do this thing. You can change even now. So, Again, here's the analysis that underpins those basic facts. First of all, there is no such thing as a genuine soft Brexit, if by that, as Ruth Davidson suggests, we mean we stay inside the single market and the customs union. If we stay inside the single market, we cannot, unless there's a massive, massive change of direction by the continental powers, we cannot possibly have control over freedom of movement. We had the referendum last year, and the country voted pretty decisively, with quite a big numerical majority, to leave the EU, primarily on the issues of immigration, taking back control over laws and borders and money. Any Conservative leader who then welched on that and said, we are not going to do this, we're going to stay inside the single market, and I'm going to give up on freedom of movement, would be lynched, would be toast. She would not survive more than a few hours if she did that. We're going to get out of the single market. That, I can promise you, that's the only way this government can survive and hold on, and that is what will happen. Ignore the siren voices off. The customs union is a slightly different matter, because the DUP are very, very worried about coming out of the customs union. The last thing that they or anybody else in Northern Ireland wants is a new hard border with the Republic. John Major, in the last 24 hours, has warned that that could lead to more attacks and a return to violence in Northern Ireland. The EU is very, very worried about that. Michel Barnier, the chief negotiator, has already been in touch with Downing Street saying, are you really, really going to secure the border with Ireland above all else? That's the most crucial thing of all. And so that the customs union is a really, really difficult matter, I think, for all of the politicians concerned. The DUP are going to encourage the government not to leave the customs union entirely. Big business, the city, don't want us to leave the customs union entirely. And there's going to be a hell of a fight, because, of course, if we don't leave the customs union, then we can't negotiate all those great new free trade deals that Liam Fox is so excited about with his shiny new department. Liam Fox, well, I don't know what you think about Liam Fox, but I can tell you this. If we stay inside the customs union, there is no point to Liam Fox at all. His job is to go around the world and negotiate lots of fantastic, shiny new trade deals. But if we can't do that, what's the point of the department? That is the one area one really big area where I think Theresa May is going to have to give in at some point. I think we will probably reluctantly agree to stay inside most of the customs union. There'll be fudges around the edges of it, and a lot of people will be very upset. But I think the Labour Party want to stay in. It's very hard to see what the Labour Party wants, actually, but I think they want to stay in. At the moment, this time in the morning, they want to stay in. By lunchtime, it'll be different. Enough Tory MPs want to stay in. The interests of, as it were, big money wants to stay in. The DUP wants to stay in. The Scottish MPs want to stay in. I think that is the biggest likely area of change. But it's not the only one. Once talks start in a few days' time, or a few weeks' time, depending on how the DUP talks go, everything is being delayed by that at the moment, then we will get into, I would predict, quite quickly this year, one hell of a fight, first of all, about money. The thing that infuriated Theresa May more than anything else, and the whole number 10 machine, was when Brussels leaked the notion after her very, very unhappy lunch with Juncker. He was whacking back the wine too fast, and then the Germans leaked everything that had happened, you may remember. They said after that, well, actually, it's not going to be £80 billion we demand up front as the bill for even talking about a new trade agreement. We want 100 billion, or more than that. That was seen even in Berlin as going far too far and a really bad misstep, and Juncker has been chastised for that internally. But there is going to be a really big gap over money. You talk to British ministers and they say, we are a law-abiding, serious country who always abide by our international obligations. We have made obligations about EU spending in the past, and we are going to meet those obligations. There will be money to pay. But that is much, much smaller than the plan of a lot of people inside the EU at the moment, which is to use the British Brexit and use the bill for the British Brexit to get them out of trouble for the next few years, because they are in real shtuck about this. The big paying-in countries, Germany above all, and the Netherlands, are saying that we are not going to pay in any more. We have absolutely come to the limit of what we can afford in terms of our EU bill. But all those countries, led by, for instance, Poland, who have taken out a lot of money from the EU coffers, aren't prepared to cut the amount of money they're taking out either. So the EU, over the next 2 or 3 years, has a really big financial crisis coming. And the question is, do they use the British negotiations to get out of that by forcing us to pay a vast amount of money, which, by the way, no manifesto, including the Conservative manifesto, has budgeted for. There's a new black hole in everybody's manifesto. If we end up paying 50 or 60 billion pounds or euros over the next few years, where does that come from? Out of which budgets does that come? What does that do to borrowing? And so forth. I would expect really quite a big bust-up, but I would also expect it to be theatrical, guerrillas charging at each other, David Davis jumping up and down, bright red storming out, huge headlines, and I would advise you, keep very calm at that point. This is a theatrical moment at the beginning of the negotiations where the British show that we are not going to be thrown around too easily. Money is going to be the first big argument. In the end, if it's a haggle over money, as you guys know, it can be sorted. People will come to a conclusion about that. The second big argument is going to be over the European Court of Justice, because in a very, very important speech in Florence, Michel Barnier, who is the chief negotiator, a very, very key figure, a rather arrogant, beautifully dressed, very, very French guy, who's actually quite pro-British. He's not the worst person we could have had as a negotiator, but he's very, very much a man who stands on ceremony, won't negotiate with the British diplomats or civil servants, only with ministers and senior ministers at that. But he gave a speech in which he said, look, the most important first principle for us is the rights of the 3 million EU citizens currently living and working in the UK, and indeed all the Brits living in other parts of the EU at the moment. And they are rights involving what happens if they lose their job, what happens to their unemployment pay, where can they move to look for other job, what happens to their families, lots and lots of really important, crunchy legal problems. And Barnier said the only way that we can absolutely guarantee these people's rights, and what we absolutely demand, therefore, from the British, is that the European Court of Justice retains oversight over those rights, which might seem reasonable enough, except that one thing that Theresa May and the Conservative Party has made crystal clear is that getting out of the EU means leaving the jurisdiction of the European Court of European Court of Justice, I beg your pardon, and the ECHR probably as well, but justice we're talking about at the moment. So there is a really big crash over which judges adjudicate the rights of EU citizens, and by the way, after that, all the trade disputes that will follow once we have left the EU. There is a deal to be done here. I call it the Guernsey court option, because you could create a new kind of supranational court involving some of our Supreme Court judges and some of their European Court judges sitting together, possibly in Guernsey or somewhere, some neutral jurisdiction. And their job would be to ensure the rights of our people on the continent and their people here, and to eventually become the main trade disputes system as well. So there is a deal to be done, and I think a deal will be done. So those are two big areas of dispute that are going to happen very quickly. And then we have to turn to probably the most sensitive issue of all, which is immigration. One of the most important consequences of the Conservatives' inability to get an overall majority and to have a coalition government is that they are going to have to drop completely their, in my view, always overstated and very hard to meet promise of reducing immigration to the tens of thousands. It's not going to happen in the short term. And that in turn means that the government negotiators can offer all sorts of side deals in return for access to the single market. So I think we will get, the British pitch will be, let us into the single market, give us unfettered, tariff-free, frictionless access to your markets, and vice versa. And in return, we will do some side deals with the EU and with individual countries about how many people we expect and will bring in as migrants on work visas. So they might say in the first year we're going to take in 80,000 people into the agriculture industry, we're going to take another 50,000 people into the building industry, and so on. And those visa deals will be very important to politicians in the Czech Republic, in Poland, in Spain and elsewhere. So that's the way we're going to approach these negotiations, I would suggest, and then there will be a deal done on the court, and finally there'll be a very bloody and very difficult deal done on the money. And by the way, in case you're wondering really why we had this election in the first place, I have a theory which I'll leave with you. It's not really to do with the fact. Theresa May said, if you remember, it was because she was being frustrated in her Brexit plans by the other parties in Parliament. This is hilariously absurd. The other parties had voted Brexit right through, the House of Lords and the House of Commons, in pretty good time, and there was no anti-Brexit majority in the House of Commons. She had a clear pro-Brexit majority. There was no need for that. So that wasn't the reason. And then people said, well, it must have been because of Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn is so useless that she was being told by her clever advisors, take him out now, and you're going to come back with a majority of 200. And then that's that. You've got your mandate. You've smashed the Labour Party forever. You are the most successful Tory leader in all time. That worked terribly well, didn't it? But even if that was part of her motivation, that doesn't quite make sense either, does it? Because, after all, if you think that Jeremy Corbyn is useless, and very few people now do, but if you did, then surely you just keep him there for as long as possible, and the Labour Party carries on decaying and going down. Why pull him out particularly now? There's no real reason for it. I think the reason that she called the election was that once Barnier said to her, look, we are going to have a deal on the court, but above all on money, before we're even prepared to talk to you about the trade deal. Once he said that, she knew that she was going to have to make some very difficult and painful compromises, probably later this summer, which she would not be able to get through the House of Commons. If she had agreed, I'm just plucking a figure out of the air, but it will all leak in Brussels, so we'll all know about this. If she had agreed, say, that we were going to pay over the next 3 years £40 billion for the privilege of leaving the EU, the Tory party in Parliament would rebel against that. A motion would be put down, and she'd lose it, and then she would have been forced to the country, having lost in the House of Commons in chaotic circumstances. And it was to avoid that car crash that she decided to take the tourist route she took, and of course hit an even bigger car crash en route. So that's what I expect to happen over the summer. I think our Brexit department is in a slightly better shape than you are being told by most of the media. There's a lot of preparation going on, including for the no deal. Now, the no deal thing is going to be talked about a lot, and again, let me just mention that because it is a nonsense. There is nobody inside the government who actually wants no deal. There is a group of Tory MPs who would quite like no deal, and like UKIP, who say, why are we even negotiating? Let's just walk away on WTO rules and stuff them. Talk to business about the consequences of that, and you go pretty ashen-faced pretty quickly. There's a group of Tory MPs who might go for the Gotterdammerung option of no deal. Nobody in government wants it, but at the same time, you can't go into a negotiation with the other side thinking that you absolutely have to agree with them on their timetable. That makes you in a very, very weak position indeed. Any of you who have negotiated anything in business will understand that. Therefore, they have to prepare for no deal, and indeed, there are groups of civil servants working out exactly how many customs sheds and how many new customs officers and so forth we would need if we came out on WTA rules without a deal. So that is being done, but I don't expect it to happen. I'm talking you through the various bits and pieces, the various headlines that I think are going to come up over the next few weeks and months about immigration, about the European Court, about no deal, about the single market and so forth. But let me start to bring it all together. I think the likeliest outcome is that Theresa May is going to remain as Prime Minister, probably for the rest of this year, and that during that process we will start relatively sensible and serious negotiations on Brexit, as a result of which we will leave the European Union. But we will leave the European Union in a gentler way than would otherwise have been the case. We may well stay inside parts, at least, of the customs union, we will do a financial deal, and we will agree some kind of supranational oversight over some areas. Now, I don't regard that as a disaster. And if you look at today's headlines in the last few days, this febrile atmosphere of we are bound to be heading for complete catastrophe. The Europeans are jeering and laughing at us. We don't know what we think. We don't know who's going to be in charge of number 10. I would just calm down a little bit. I don't think it's as bad as that. I think that we are going to do some kind of deal. Eventually, Theresa May is going to look at the Conservative Party, and the Conservative Party is going to look back at Theresa May, and they're going to say, do you know what you did? You had a terrible, terrible campaign in 2017, but you said one thing that has restored our faith in you. You said to us at the 1922 committee afterwards, you said, I got us into this mess, and I will get us out of it. Thank you very much indeed, Theresa May. You have done what you said. But we never, ever want to be led into a general election campaign by you again. Frankly, you've got to learn how to speak human. You've got to learn how to give at least vaguely plausible answers when you're asked reasonable questions and so forth. And you've got to learn how to do a Mexican wave while you're at it. So I don't think they want to go into the next election. Therefore, there will be as soon as the Brexit negotiations look like they're virtually completed, she will say, I've done the job you elected me to do. I said I was the Prime Minister who would get us out of the mess of last summer. Remember the mess of last summer when Michael Gove was stabbing Boris Johnson in the front and Boris Johnson was falling over with his trousers down. It was just blood and mayhem and chaos everywhere. And there's a general sense that the clever, clever boys have absolutely smashed things up. And it takes a sensible woman to come in and clear the mess up. That was why they wanted her in the first place. And she will be able to say, do you know what, I did that. I cleared up the mess despite this election campaign. I did in the end clear up the mess. And at that point, they will say, thank you very much and goodbye. And there will be another Tory election, leadership election, before the next election. And then the runners and riders are very, very interesting. Boris, obviously, there's always Boris. There has been there's no week or month in the last few years when Boris has not been planning his ascent to the top job. The trampling of Boris, the snorting in the undergrowth and rhododendrons is a kind of perpetual sound in Westminster. So there'll be Boris. There might even be others. Michael Gove might try to stab him in the front again. I wouldn't advise it, but he might. The person I would look out for very closely is the most important and influential person in the government by far, except possibly the Prime Minister, but I say possibly the Prime Minister, and that is David Davis. David Davis, as Brexit Secretary, was one of the people who led the Leave campaign. But of all the people who led the Leave campaign, you can't say that David Davis is nuts or mad or extreme. He's actually a very wily, very experienced, in his 60s, very experienced, tough negotiator. He's the kind of guy that you would all find easy to work with. And he knows that compromise is going to have to be made over immigration, over money, over jurisdiction, while at the same time producing a deal that allows the government to say, we promise to get back control over our borders and our money and migration, and we have done that. He is a deal maker. He understands how to do that. He's quite close to Damien Green, the new Deputy Prime Minister. He's reasonably close after a few bruising encounters with the Chancellor of the Exchequer as well. And he is the guy, I think, who will be central to holding things together inside the government as they go through this very, very rocky period. And if anybody emerges with their reputation enhanced as a proper doer, I think it's going to be David Davis. So that's one little tip I'd give you for making bets ahead. Finally, I want to do a warning about everything I have just said, because a government with no real majority, with a very sticky coalition agreement with the DUP, and it's not a proper coalition agreement, it's probably going to be a supply agreement deal, which means that they basically, if it's a vote of confidence in the government, or it's like a vote of confidence in the government, the DUP absolutely vote with them. If it's about money, if it's a budget measure, the DUP absolutely vote with them, so that Theresa May knows that she's not going to be voted down in a vote of confidence and that she's going to be able to get the money through the House of Commons. But beyond that, the government is going to have to negotiate absolutely everything with the DUP, line by line by line. And that's going to be very, very difficult because, as we now know, all of us, they are very, very different from the modern Conservative Party when it comes to social issues. Ian Paisley Jr.'s father, and that's the origins of the DUP, mounted a ferocious campaign. I've got a colleague of mine who's got the misfortune to be gay and Northern Irish, who was growing up. The big campaign, the posters he saw around him was "Save Ulster from Sodomy." And it's a bit of "Save Ulster from Sodomy" and some very tough lines on abortion and so forth. That is going to go down very badly. He's already going down very badly with the Conservative Party. Ruth Davidson, who, as I mentioned, is gay herself, actually went to Belfast and made a speech in favour of civil marriages for gay people in Belfast as a point of attacking the DUP. And then as soon as this possible agreement was announced, she retweeted that speech, making her views very clear indeed. So there are going to be lots and lots of areas where Conservative MPs and the DUP don't see eye to eye. Stuff will happen because it always does. Somebody will have a heart attack, sadly, and die. There will be a by-election because of some really obscure scandal. There will be another very, very odd issue that no one had predicted will suddenly come up, and the government will be defeated on it. So life in a government or parliament of this nature is much more uncertain, and for people like me, a great deal more fun, I have to say, than life normally. We will be watching day by day by day. I don't know if any of you have seen, there's a play called This House, which was about the whip's office in the 1970s at the tail end of the Callaghan administration, when again the government was hanging by a thread. And in those days, very, very sick MPs were taken by ambulance to the House of Commons and carried through the voting lobbies on stretchers. The whips used to go through the toilets, banging on the doors and then looking underneath the doors to check that no MPs were hiding, didn't want to come out. The bars were emptied of comatose, totally drunk members, and again dragged through the voting lobbies. It was a battle night after night after night to keep that government alive. And of course, in the end, Margaret Thatcher killed it off in the subsequent election. Now, we're going to see something very similar, I think, happening. The dramas in the House of Commons over the next 12 months or so are going to be utterly extraordinary. We're going to see hugely important by-elections. We're going to possibly see the return of old figures. There is even a rumour, and you heard it here first, even a rumour that Tony Blair thinks he could come back in a by-election. He must be looking at Jeremy Corbyn's success and wincing. But we're living through a period when nothing is impossible, and the politics of this are going to get wilder and wilder and wilder. But I want to take you right back to where I started. And so, say, when you're looking at a very, very fluid and difficult situation like this, it's best to say, what's the big fact? The big fact is the Tory party right now really doesn't want an election. Where does that lead us? That means that Theresa May almost certainly stays as leader. Then you look at the numbers in the House of Commons. Can the Conservative Party, after this election, really get Brexit through the House of Commons? Answer, actually, yes, but they're going to have to make some compromises. Are those compromises going to be catastrophic to the country? Nigel Farage will probably say yes. Many other people will say no, not at all. And so it's not as bad as it looked. It's been an extraordinary ride, and I hope some of you joined us on the BBC while we were taking you on it. I had the great good fortune. Strange job you get. I was the one who phoned number 10 at 10 p.m. on the election night to tell them what the exit poll said. And if you remember, the exit poll was the one which said they had got no majority at all. And there was a very, very long silence, and the voice came back and said, Andrew, that is completely wrong. That is flat wrong. We don't believe it. And I hope the BBC isn't going to make a fool of itself by putting that kind of nonsense out tonight. So we were wrong, but they were wrong too. Even Jeremy Corbyn didn't expect this kind of result. He's been living on cloud nine ever since, fossicking with his marrows or whatever he does when he's having some time off. It is an extraordinary period. Now, what I'm hoping is that you have questions for me, because if you don't, we're going to have to go away early, but I'm hoping that some questions, and some mics and the thing. There's a gentleman right here at the front. And by the way, if you've got questions, don't limit yourself necessarily to what I've been talking about, because there's lots more to say. So questions on almost anything. Anything printable.
Where's your local pub?
Where's my local pub? My local pub is the Princess of Wales in Ebury, not in Ebury Street, in Chalcott Road.
See you there.
Good man.
Hello. Thank you for a very entertaining and informative presentation. I think I'm now even more surprised that you've never actually punched any of your guests live on television. Nick Gowing spoke to the conference on Monday. One of the points he made was the human dimension in activities such as thinking, planning, decision-making, etc. This has been very evident, I believe, in the last year or so. At the risk of putting words in his mouth, I think what he was saying was that don't ignore factors like incompetence, greed, stupidity, egos, and the simple desire to stay in paid employment as major influences on behaviour. I believe I've seen this in industry. Is it any better in politics and with politicians? Or to put it bluntly, are any of them any bloody good?
Two different questions there. First of all, at the risk of sounding cynical, it's worse in politics. In the sense, they're all sitting there, they're all manoeuvring in their heads the whole time about who's up, who's down, if such and such a disaster happens, so he goes down, so maybe I come up. They're thinking and briefing like that the whole time. Look at the extraordinary amount of briefing already coming out of the cabinet about the coming war between Philip Hammond on the one side and others. Fiona Hill and Nick Timothy, the so-called poisonous duo who advised Theresa May, were behind a lot of the briefing, and they have been got rid of, but the briefing goes on, it always goes on. It's why people like I have rather easy jobs in the end, because there's always somebody on the other end of the phone to pick it up. But I would also stick up for politicians to this extent. They have particularly now with Brexit, they have a ferociously difficult job ahead of them. Most of them are dog-tired, absolutely shattered by the election, barely able to walk or speak. They now have to gather themselves up and go straight into difficult negotiations and hold together a fractious, rebellious, very, very tricky House of Commons. That's why when Theresa May said, I got you into this mess, I got you, I will get you out of it. I rather liked the sound of that. I thought that was grown up, that was leadership. They're not all terrible, and some of them are very clever indeed. But there is an abnormal amount of bickering, there is an abnormal amount of sniping and briefing and leaking. And I'm afraid with a very, very small majority and a divided cabinet, it's going to be worse, not better, or better for us, worse for the country. Two things always go together. What's good for journalists is bad for the country, and vice versa.
Building on that point of manifesting competence, what would your fantasy cabinet look like?
What would my fantasy cabinet look like? God. They're mostly dead, unfortunately. I'd bring back Dennis Healey into the Treasury at this stage as an old bruiser. I'd like to see. I'd actually like to see Amber Rudd moved up. I think she's been very, very bright and very good. David Davis, I've talked about already. I think is excellent. Who else would I bring in? I think. I mean, he's a man really, really enjoying his new job. But in terms of his ability to communicate and have a very, very clear sense of where the Tory party ought to be going, he was hated by the country, but I think George Osborne should be back. One of the weird things at the moment is lots and lots of the really talented politicians who should be at the centre of things, helping us get through this mess, find themselves, when the music stops, in the wrong place. Ruth Davidson, by far the most talented, she should be chair of the Conservative Party. She should be Deputy Prime Minister. She's an absolutely brilliant campaigner, real chutzpah, and she has a great way of putting things, quite often quite rude. I interviewed her at the time of the Brexit referendum, where she was on the Remain side, and I said to her, well, you're losing this, you know, Ruth. And she said, Andrew, hold fast and trust the British people. I said, really? I really think you're... She said, anyway, we haven't unleashed our secret weapon yet. And I said, what's the secret weapon, Ruth? And she said, I'm the secret weapon. I'm up against Boris at Wembley. I'm going to tear the little fucker limb from limb. I mean, she's a real fighter, that woman. And you know, I'd like to see her. But she's in the wrong parliament. She's in the Scottish parliament, not in the British parliament. So she finds herself in the wrong place. George Osborne finds himself at the bench of the London Evening Standard, not at the benches of the House of Commons. The brightest of his generation in the Labour Party, David Miliband, even finds himself on the wrong continent. He's still in New York. So a lot of the key people, I'm afraid, are just not available to us. But I've mentioned some of the names there anyway. Gentleman here.
Are the Tories accepting a return to violence in Northern Ireland as a price of retaining power in Westminster? And having seen the effects of Manchester and London attacks, much increased mainland terrorism?
Well, that would be a catastrophe. You'll have seen John Major, Sir John Major of all people, warning against this thing. It's a very fragile peace agreement. We have to trust the current Northern Ireland Secretary at the moment, Brokenshaw, that he is not confusing his role as the arbiter, the fair arbiter between the two parties, with his involvement in the negotiations being done between the DUP and the Conservative Party. But the point made by Sinn Féin, which is, how is it possible for the same Conservative leaders to both be completely neutral and fair arbiters and at the same time depend for their very own political future on the DUP? How can those things be true at the same time? I think it's a very strong point. And if there is any aspect of the DUP Conservative Party agreement, which I trust, I asked Michael Fallon, will we see this? And he said, yes, we will. So if there's any aspect of that which seems to be putting the knife into Sinn Féin or the nationalist side in terms of cutting money or allocating new budgets to unionist areas, that will be totally lethal. Secondly, if the Conservatives do a deal on the border, which means the return of customs barriers and wire fences and all the rest of it, that will be lethal. I don't think the second thing will happen, by the way, because the Irish government, the British government, and almost everybody outside the EU are determined that it won't. So if all the players want there to be effectively no more border between the North and the South, there won't be one. And there'll be a lot of talk about it. I'd be amazed if it ever happened. So I think that's one area, but the government's got to be really dead careful with the details of this deal, which is perhaps why it's taking so long. I hope so.
Andrew, I've got two questions. First of all, how do you manage and contain your frustration when your guest is being evasive or is simply lying? And the second one is, if it was not about Brexit, do you think Jeremy Corbyn has any chance of coming in?
Okay, we'll take them one by one. In terms of the frustration, I'm a very, very calm, gentle individual with a very low boiling point. But I think there is actually a really serious and problematical issue for people like me, which is if you say to Theresa May, what day of the week is it tomorrow? And she says, strong and stable. And you say, but Prime Minister, how long have you been inside the cabinet? Strong and stable. Prime Minister, what's the name of your husband? Strong and stable. Which is how it quite often feels. And there are many other, I just used that example, but there are plenty of others. If you're simply not getting an answer, in other words, and it's perfectly obvious to the audience, you can do one of two things. You can carry on asking the question again and again and again. You have to do it a few times to make that clear. You can get stagily angry and bright red and look affronted and be rude to them. Or you can do what I tend to do, which is say, well, people will have noticed that you haven't answered the question, and move on. Once you've said that 2 or 3 times in an interview, they start to look very uneasy. My job, I can't force people to answer questions. I can't nail them to the floor. I can't tear their tongues out. You know, I can't behave in a particularly brutal fashion. All I can do is ask the sensible questions that an intelligent, well-informed viewer would want to be asked. And if the other person, if the minister or the shadow minister refuses to answer that question, ask it again. Say, but you haven't really answered the question I was asking. The question I was asking was this, not that. And they still refuse to answer it. Maybe a third time as well. And then you just say, well, you have decided not to answer that question. I had that with Theresa May when, you may remember, we sent a nuclear missile by mistake at America. It went off in the wrong, it wasn't armed, but you remember one of our submarines fired a missile in the wrong direction. And I was asking her, did she know about it? Had she been briefed about it? And she just refused to say. And I asked her the same question 4 times. I said, well, you clearly decided not to tell people what's happening there, and moved on. And within 6 hours after the interview, she'd had to put out a statement saying that she did know. So in other words, if you make it clear to the viewers, because a lot of them, 2 million people or so watch the show, that somebody is not answering an important question, then the pressure for them ultimately to get an answer becomes greater and greater. I think that's the best I can do in those circumstances. As to Jeremy Corbyn, this is the most extraordinary political figure, really, of my lifetime. We regarded him with complete derision, many of us, as this kind of affable, accidental party leader who'd ambled in off his allotment with bits of kind of twig and straw in his beard, who thought it was still basically 1973. Gerry Adams was a genial Irish poet. And anybody who did this around the world was by definition on the right side. There's no way we thought that he could be a successful party leader. And then we got stories from inside the shadow cabinet. The one I heard the other day was he called an absolutely crucial meeting on some big matter of policy. They had 20 minutes to make up their minds about it. And Jeremy started the meeting. There were 19 people there saying, who would like a cup of tea? And then he went away and made a cup of tea individually for all the 19 people, by which time, of course, it was too late to take any decisions, and the meeting ended without any decisions being taken. And he has around him some pretty hard-faced characters as well. He's very genial, but some people around him are a bit less genial. I'm John MacDonald, and I laugh all the time because you say, so John, you were a great supporter of the... I was a bit hot-headed at the time. John, you said that you'd like Margaret Thatcher to be shot. I did. I lost my temper. We call him laughing John MacDonald. So it seemed a completely implausible thing. And it's very interesting that the entire political commentariat got him so utterly and totally wrong. And I think the reason is this, that we had forgotten that it is true that Jeremy Corbyn can't really run a shadow cabinet very effectively. He can't sustain the loyalty of lots of his own MPs. He can't do this, he can't do that. But he can do 2 things. He can grow very fine marrows, and he can campaign. All he has done all his life, really, he has campaigned. Campaigned against this, campaigned for that, campaigned against the next thing. He has always been out there campaigning, addressing crowds. And of course, suddenly, when all the focus and all the TV attention of a general election campaign comes onto him, he looks very different. And the other thing is that he has this glorious naivety. he does actually answer the question. The very first time I interviewed him, I thought, so what's the question he's not expecting? I thought, I know, he is in fact a Marxist, so I'll just ask him. And so I said halfway through the interview, by the way, Jeremy Corbyn, are you a Marxist? Now, every other politician in the UK would have laughed and said, Andrew, don't be silly. Jeremy said, that's a very interesting question. And then to a certain extent, he was. Now, people thought this was appalling, but actually, in a political culture where so many politicians, as you were just saying, don't answer the question, a politician who surprises you by answering, even if you don't like the answer, is quite refreshing. And I think particularly for younger voters who are so turned off politics, somebody who said what he meant and when asked a straightforward question, gave a straightforward answer, did surprisingly well. And I think really if the Tory party is rethinking what they got wrong in this election, never again send out somebody as the leader of the party who won't answer obvious and direct questions, won't speak human. And then, of course, the other thing they've got to do is to understand social media, because social media is the other huge part of this story. Very, very effective, very funny, very direct. And again, forgive me for bad language, but I'll give you one example. Within about 30 seconds of the exit poll coming out, and if you remember, just a few hours after we'd had that story about Theresa May running through fields of wheat as a young girl, somebody tweeted a picture of a cornfield from the air with the word fuck written in it. and the slogan, Theresa's been running in the fields again. Now that kind of very fast political wit engages, amuses, galvanizes younger people, and lots of them were brought out to vote by the social media. Tory party that's got any chance of winning the next election, and who knows, has to learn how to use social media and has to learn how to answer questions on the Andrew Marr show. Speaking of which, are there any more questions I can answer if you're here? Somebody here.
As part of our Brexit negotiations, do you think that one of our red lines will be the rights of Gibraltar citizens, or is that one of the easy ones for them to give away?
I think they can't give that away. I talked about social media just now, but the power of traditional newspapers remains quite strong in this country. And if the Conservative Party gave away Gibraltar, the Express and the Mail would never forgive them, and they would not recover from that unforgiveness. It would be a brutal, brutal thing. It would be seen as absolute betrayal of kith and kin. It will not happen, I predict. There's a lady here.
Certainly Donald Trump running through fields of wheat would match the wheat quite nicely, wouldn't it? But we talked about whether Theresa will last the end of the year. Do you think Donald Trump will last to the end of the year?
A few weeks after his election, it was the kind of liberal, Democrat, bien-pensant view in Washington that he would be impeached. And I thought, come off it, it's ridiculous. But the more I see of the fight between him and Comey, the more I see of what Comey is saying, and the paper trail, including official minutes of meetings at which Trump was putting pressure on the FBI and the CIA over the Russia connection, lead me to think the paper trail may be so strong that there will be an official investigation. The formal investigation will get going, and in those circumstances, it is possible that he will be impeached. I don't know enough about the details of exactly what is known about who said what to who, but I think it's getting harder for him all the time. And the amount of trouble he's in is distracting him from the main job. Not that he needs much distraction, but it is. We had in America, pollsters are much more important than they are here. Pollsters are very, very key to and have very high status in the party. And I was talking to a very senior Republican pollster who'd worked with Donald Trump. This is before Trump got the nomination even. And I said, so we're going through the candidates. I said, what about Donald Trump? He said, well, Donald Trump, you don't have to worry about Donald on policy because he doesn't have policies. He has an idea at breakfast, and an hour later he's got another idea, and he's forgot the first one. Don't worry about that. He will be sat on. The establishment will, if he ever became president, the establishment would give him the policies he needed when he needed them. The trouble with Donald, he said, is he has got absolutely no attention span. He loses the plot very quickly, and he has a volcanic and unpredictable temper. So it's temperament, he said, you have to worry about, not policies, just the temperament. Now, I said, the trouble with that, of course, is you can change policies, but you can't change temperament. And he looked at me and said, exactly. So I think, well, it's very interesting, though, since we're talking about Trump, one other point about Trump is, I think if you look at the Brexit debate, the Conservative Party always gets into a lot of trouble when it distances itself too far from the interests of big money or capitalism, call it what you will. So if the city wants one kind of Brexit, but the Tory party is going to give them a different kind of Brexit, the Tories are ultimately in trouble. And the same is true in America. If the American president gets too out of whack with the interests of big money and the way that American capitalism, to use a big business, imposes itself upon the world, the president is in trouble. Now, if you look at that first court case against Trump's proposed migrant ban, the so-called Muslim ban, that came not from Washington, D.C., but from Washington State. Very, very expensive case to mount, and the president lost it. So ask yourself, who financed that case? And the answer is 2 high-tech companies. In the modern world, the 5 biggest companies by capitalization are all Californian, US, high-tech companies of one kind or another, the Googles, the Amazons, and so forth. They are the people who change our lives in this country and around the world. They are America's commercial and industrial footprint on the globe. And they are terrified of 2 things. They're terrified of a really brutal immigration restriction because they require so many very, very highly talented Indian and European and French and German and indeed British people to move over there and help make their companies as successful as they are. So they were very, very worried about Trump's migrant ban. And the second thing that they're very worried about, of course, is a trade war with China. Because China is where they make their stuff and then ship it around the world to the rest of us. And so it's very, very interesting. The first two big reverses that happened to the Trump administration were he had to row back on the immigration ban. We're going to see more battles about that, but nonetheless, that's where the first big court case against him was, and he's had to pull back a bit on that. No war yet. And the second thing, of course, is that he's made nice with the Chinese. After all, I wonder why, and I think you can see, if you pose the question, in a real tussle of interest, as between Silicon Valley and Washington, between Washington State and Washington, D.C., between the biggest companies in the world and the President of the United States, who ultimately wins that battle? And it's a really, really interesting question, but I don't think the answer is necessarily the President of the United States. Any other thoughts? The gentleman here.
Tellingly, you've made very little mention of the smaller parties, the Lib Dems and others. Are they out of the conversation now for the next 5 years? And do you think the Prime Minister would try again with the Boundary Commission and redo the seats?
The Boundary Commission is what the Tory party is relying on, but it's very hard, of course, in this Parliament to get it through. I mean, it could be done. The smaller parties are in terrible trouble. One of the great mysteries of the election, even now, is why the Liberal Democrats didn't do better. Given that 48% of the country voted to stay inside the EU, and given that they were the only UK-wide party saying we must stay inside the EU, we must reverse Brexit with a second referendum or whatever, you would expect them to have picked up a lot of seats. And I know in London there were lots of constituencies where people defected from the Labour Party and the other parties, moved into the Lib Dems and tried to win those seats. But they got very, very little traction, only a few seats. And I'm afraid, I don't like to be personal about these, I just don't think Tim Farron was a very good leader. I don't think he was clear enough about what his purpose was. A lot of these things are not great big social movements or inevitable. They're about the individual foibles of individual leaders and moments. And somehow the Lib Dems, they got deflected by the gay sex argument early in the campaign, and Tim Farron didn't have quite the kind of the weight and the passion that, for instance, Nick Clegg would have had, or Paddy Ashdown would have had on the European issue, and failed to ignite the country. And I think they have lost that chance, and I don't see a big prospect of them going much further forward in the future. So I think they are out of the conversation. The other party we should have talked about, of course, are the SNP in Scotland, who lost a lot of seats, 23 seats, and they had been by an overwhelmingly the biggest party. They had almost all the seats. And in this election, they lost seats, 13 seats they lost to the Tories, but they also lost seats to the Labour Party and to the Lib Dems in Scotland. And that is very, very significant, because in politics, momentum, not with a big M, not Jeremy Corbyn's momentum, but momentum generally is really, really important. And in Scotland, the momentum had all been towards a second independence referendum, and as you know, Scotland had voted to stay inside the EU, and therefore the Brexit vote was the big substantial change in circumstances that Nicola Sturgeon said was needed for a second independence referendum. And I was up there filming. I met lots of, for instance, Labour Party people who were pro-union, who said, but you know what, this time around I'm going to have to change. If there's another election, another referendum, I will vote for independence because I'm so pro-European. I can't stand staying in a Tory Britain outside the EU for the rest of my life. I want us to be inside the EU, and if that means the UK breaking up, so be it. So there's a lot of pressure for a second referendum, and I know the Scottish economy is shot because of the oil price, but nevertheless, there's a lot of pressure there for a second referendum. This general election has pushed that really to one side. I think Nicola Sturgeon cannot call a second independence referendum in the near future. And therefore, for those of you who think that the United Kingdom is a good idea, that's good news. Another gentleman. This gentleman at the front, and then this gentleman. Sorry, just.
Is UKIP finished, or is there a possibility it could resurrect itself?
If going back to that rather complicated part of what I was saying earlier on about the likely nature of the deal, if I put it to you that the Conservatives will ultimately do a deal which involves staying inside the customs union, they're leaving the single market, paying a reasonably hefty price to leave, so there's no chance of that 350 million a year coming to the NHS, and making public side agreements which make it clear that although we have, quotes, taken back control, quotes, over immigration, quite high immigration levels continue, then UKIP has a chance of coming back. It'll be like some kind of earth-stained monster coming up from the grave. Nigel Farage looking even ropier than usual. Pretty terrifying thought. But then they have a case for saying, do you know what? The Conservatives have betrayed us over Brexit. If they can say that and be heard with credibility in the country, they have a chance of coming back. If not, not. Poor old Paul Nuttall tried to, I think possibly the most incompetent party leader of my lifetime, tried to rebrand UKIP briefly as the kind of anti-Muslim party, and that went down really, really badly. It didn't work at all. And if they're not that, what are they? They have always tried very, very hard not to be a racist party or a xenophobic party, but to be a party interested in sovereignty and interested in Brexit. Only, therefore, if the Tories betray proper Brexit, do they have a chance of coming back. But there is a chance of the Tories doing just that thing, of course. So those are the circumstances. I think there's another gentleman here.
On Friday morning, you summed up one of the most remarkable statistics of a remarkable night with the comment about the Kensington result as,
yes.
I think I'm right in saying, Harvey Nicks has gone all trot,
yeah.
Which was indeed very amusing. What, if you had to look at the reasons for the Tory result, what do you see as the single biggest reason for their failure?
Okay, well, I think what happened is, broadly speaking, this. Theresa May called the election unexpectedly, reversing what she had promised to do, which is not to call an election, and then didn't give a really convincing reason why she was calling it. As I've suggested, I think she was calling it because she thought she was going to be defeated by her own MPs in the House of Commons for, quotes, betraying Brexit, quotes. But she could hardly announce that outside Downing Street, I suppose. So she starts off on the back foot. She then says, this election is about Brexit. And on no occasion does she explain what that means. She gives us no indication whether, if given a bigger majority, she would have gone for a softer Brexit or a harder Brexit, a quicker Brexit, a longer Brexit. She won't talk about any of that at all. She simply says strong and stable, strong and stable, strong and stable, strong, till the entire country is comatose. It was a terrible, terrible campaign. Then, two things are going on. One, the Labour Party with momentum are galvanising young voters in a way we have never seen in this country before. 1 million new registrations, and you look at the effect of young voters up and down the country. Kensington certainly, but also Canterbury. Canterbury has been Tory since, I think, 1935, and went Labour. Why? Lots and lots of students in Canterbury. So that was going on. And then on the other side, brilliantly, in the Conservative manifesto, they identified the biggest group of loyal Tory voters who turn out and vote, pensioners, and they pissed them off. They said, with abandoning the triple lock, the so-called dementia tax, mess up, and of course the winter fuel payments. An absolutely brilliant way of getting your own voters to stay at home while the other people are getting their voters out. So it was a combination, I think, of all of those three things. When we say a bad campaign, that terrible manifesto has a lot to do with it. And by the way, wasn't much mentioned at the time, though I tried to do it on the show, the Labour manifesto, whatever you thought of it, and its huge, huge spending and taxation commitments, huge borrowing commits, massive, massive old-fashioned tax and spend socialism, but it was costed. The numbers were there. They said we're going to raise this amount from corporation tax and so forth. The Conservative manifesto was completely uncosted. And when they said, and their proposition was, you can trust us, we're Conservatives, we don't need to do the numbers. Don't bother your pretty little heads about the numbers. I come back to the fact those numbers, as we leave the EU, are likely to contain billions and billions, unknown billions and billions of pounds as the exit bill from the EU, their idea. Where's that going to come from? Plus, of course, the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, the Tories' own organisation they set up, who have costed independently the price of cutting immigration, therefore losing the tax of lots and lots of people currently working here. They say if you cut it to 185,000 per year, in other words, it's still much higher than Theresa May is saying she's going to take it to. The cost to that, the cost to the Exchequer is just under £6 billion a year. It's a lot of money, and again, completely uncosted. So a really bad manifesto, an uncosted manifesto, and just the most robotic, unconvincing campaign I've seen, at the same time as, you know, behind the scenes, Jezza and his mates are getting the youth vote out. I think that tells you all you need to know. More questions? There's gentlemen, since you're right there, why don't you? Sorry. I'm so sorry. We'll take one more here and then.
Good afternoon, Andrew. The political situation in the UK is absolutely fascinating. Across the channel in France, it is equally surprising and mesmerizing. Yep. As you can tell from my accent, I am from France, obviously. So the current situation now, as it is, with the almost complete annihilation of any opposition, do you see that as a chance and an opportunity for France and its economy, or a danger for democracy?
Well, very interesting. I thought you were from Kensington by your accent, by the way.
Correct. South Kensington, precisely.
No, well, I've interviewed Emmanuel Macron, and he's really, really impressive and uncannily, to us, like a young Blair before Blair went bad, if I can put it that way. But the real question, as you know better than anybody, is whether he is going to actually modernize the French economy. Within hours of him being elected, there were already demonstrations in the streets of Paris from the far left against what might or might not be his union reforms and his labour market reforms. He has a deal to do with the Germans whereby he delivers labour market reforms sufficient to really kickstart the French economy, and in return the Germans do what they need to do on the purse strings for the future of Europe. That deal, I think, is possible, but he really has to show steel. He's been very, very good, but he's also been very, very lucky in the campaign. He was lucky in his the other contenders on the right, many of whom were very implausible or got into trouble with scandals. I think he was lucky in many respects with the way Marine Le Pen fought her campaign, right at the last minute, tacking back to the old, dark side of the National Front just at the wrong moment. So he's been lucky. He now needs to prove, having got his great En Marche, République En Marche, REM, we think of them like the rock band, a majority in the National Assembly. He now needs to use that fast to make big changes, because this is his moment of maximum power. And if he fritters it away and doesn't act very quickly now, then he will live to regret it, I would have thought. Can we take another question? There's a question, gentleman in the middle there.
Hi, thanks for all the comments so far, really interesting. Just picking up on a couple of things you said in terms of the level of fatigue of politicians and the heavy focus and complexity of the Brexit negotiations. Are we in danger of losing our capability, if not our presence on the world stage? And have we got the strength and depth in our current political party and politicians to actually do what needs to be done for the globe, not just for the UK, on that basis?
We have to get Brexit right. And we have to remember that we have got a lot of big global institutions in this country which still really matter, from Oxfam onwards. It's not all about government. And some really big global companies here as well. If we can maintain the kind of business environment in which big global companies want to work from Britain, and if we can maintain the strong NGO environment, then we can have a big influence on the world stage. If Jeremy Corbyn becomes Prime Minister, I think Trident is gone. We'll probably lose our seat on the Security Council as a result. Brexit does not need to be a disaster for us, but we have a very, very difficult year ahead of us, and we really do depend upon this government to get a good deal and do it fast. If we can do that, then the future's bright, the future's orange, as Ian Paisley said. Sorry about that. I think very, very quickly, we're out of time. One quick last one.
Thank you. Given the majorities last week, there were like 2 here and 10 here and 100 somewhere else. I think it was calculated that if 2,000 more people had voted for the Labour Party in various places, the result would have been totally different.
And a few hundred the other way for the Tories, by the way.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you think if more people had actually got off their backsides, and if there was a vote tomorrow, do you think more people would have got off their backsides and actually changed the result, given what we know now?
Absolutely. I think there was a lot of complacency on the centre-right of politics. Corbyn can get nowhere near power. You don't need to bother to get out. I'm quite hacked off. Theresa May, don't really like her as much as I thought I did, therefore I won't bother. But this is always the case with elections. You never know until too late whether your vote could have counted. I always say, whatever your views, get out there and vote, but I'm very much against compulsory voting as they have in Australia. I think that's unnecessarily sort of statist or authoritarian. But the truth of the matter is, we had a huge electorate this time. If you look at since the war, the number of people voting elections has gone down and down and down, and now it's going up again. And that in itself is a very, very good thing. It shows that people are paying attention and are really energized by politics for reasons that we've been hearing about over the last hour. Thank you all very much indeed.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed for putting so much fun into uncertainty for us. I think we all need that occasionally. Thank you all very much for coming to this great conference, and I'd just like to put my first advert in there. Next year we're in Liverpool, so on the 11th to 13th of June. So please come along again for another great conference, and in the meantime, safe travels. Thank you very much.